Our topic today is building aligned AI. AI is fast becoming humanity's most powerful technology, but the future trajectory of AI contains many uncertainties. It's uncertain how fast AI will improve. It's uncertain when new kinds of AI functionality will arrive and how well they'll work. And there are uncertainties about the overall architecture of the AIs that turn out to be the most dominant and successful. But despite all these uncertainties, it's clear that AIs will be playing more and more significant roles in all aspects of our lives. Therefore, we need to ask, how can we increase the probability that the AIs will act in ways that are aligned with overall human flourishing? That's as opposed to serving some other goals in which overall humans would fare less well. Our speaker today, who I'll hand over to in a moment, has given a great deal of thought to the questions of aligned AI. He is Dr. Stuart Armstrong, co-founder and chief research officer of Aligned AI. Stuart did parts 1, 2, and 3 of the Cambridge University Mathematical Tripos, where his pass mark was in the top 4% of the program. He then did a doctorate in mathematics at the University of Oxford, followed by some postdoctoral research in Vienna, Austria, before working in a biotechnology research lab in Oxford. At that point, he joined the Oxford University Future of Humanity Institute, where he worked for just over 10 years on the design of safe and aligned AI systems, before co-founding Aligned AI in November of last year. Stuart, the floor is yours. Welcome to London Futurists.
Thank you. Yes, AI may be the most important technology of the century, might end up being the most important technology that humanity will have ever developed. And I've been thinking and worrying about it for a long time, though now I am somewhat more positive that we might have a favorable outcome. How could we align AI? This is a meandering story about myself, about how I came to work in aligning AI and how we might succeed in that task. There's a concept that everyone in investment knows about, which is seeking the highest return on investment. This applies even if you're trying to have a positive impact in the world, if you're trying to do charitable work. And in fact, it applies even more strongly there. So what is the most good that we can do? Let's pick an example of something good. There's Kaposi's sarcoma. It's an unpleasant side effect of HIV. It can be treated. If you treat it, the person with this has a better quality of life. This is definitely a good. But how good is it? And how much does it cost to get that good? Well, there's a unit called the QALY, Quality Adjusted Life Year, which is roughly how long will the person live more at a decent quality of life. And it's imperfect, but it's pretty much one of the best measures we have. And if we look at treating Kaposi's sarcoma in terms of QALYs per £1,000, we get roughly 2/3 of a QALY. So slightly less than a year per £1,000 invested. I mean, this seems good. If I would definitely pay more than £1,000 a year to have a high quality of life. But can we do better? Well, we can. Antiretroviral therapy turns out to be reaching almost 2 QALYs. And we can go even more extreme with the prevention of transmission during pregnancy, reaches up into 4, 5. The reason this one has so much QALYs is because if you prevent the baby from getting HIV, this will extend for its entire life. So there's a lot of years that you can get from this. Can we do even better than that? Well, one clue is that I am changing the scale. And yes, we can. And for instance, condom distribution reaches almost 20 qualis. Now, this is an interesting contrast with the prevention of transmission. That was effective because it lasted so long and had such a strong impact. Condom distribution is effective because it is so cheap. So for £1,000, you can just do so much of condom distribution relative to prevention of transmission during pregnancy. And if we compare, say, condom distribution and Kaposi's sarcoma treatment, then if we're going to invest in a charity, if we invested in the inefficient one, we would be basically writing off, burning away 19 years of life through inefficient investment. In fact, it would be much better for the world if we halved our charitable distribution, spent the other half on having a big party, and reallocated the half to more efficient interventions. But all these are in the HIV AIDS domain. Is this really the most effective conventional intervention? It turns out it's not. Bed net distributions against malaria seems to be the highest and most effective intervention at the moment, over 50 qualis per £1,000. These figures come from Giving What We Can and GiveWell, who are great organizations and track the most efficient way to do charity. So this is about as far as you can go in conventional charitable interventions. But can we do better? Can we get hundreds, thousands, or millions of qualis? We can. This is Fritz Haber, the inventor of the Haber-Bosch process. I will let you guess who the co-inventor of that process was. But he's quite interesting because he had the main role in creating chemical warfare during the First World War. So caused a lot of misery in that conflict. However, via the Haber-Bosch process, which fixes nitrogen from the air into ammonia and therefore creates fertilizers, we can estimate that there's at least 1 billion people alive today who wouldn't be alive if we had not had that particular innovation. In more recent times, we have the Green Revolution from Borlaug, which is basically the reason that Mexico and India have functioning agricultures today, and at least 250 million have been saved by this. Further back in time, the smallpox vaccine is again accounting for another 500 million people's lives saved at least. So it seems that another way of having a huge positive impact is to have a great agricultural, food-based, or medical intervention in the world. And even if you have a small chance of succeeding at this, your expected impact can get huge. In fact, there seems to be only one way of getting a higher impact than this, and that's to take some devastating disaster and stop it from happening. So that is what we have been looking at the Future of Humanity Institute. We looked at a variety of different risks that may threaten the future. 4 of them were true existential risks: nuclear war, which has become fashionable, unfortunately, again recently, but the nukes have never gone away. Global pandemics, which is again, we're seeing that wave. Synthetic biology risks, and AI, which might seem the odd one out there. In fact, AI is quite interesting because it has some of the most extreme uncertainties imaginable, predicting AI development and the future of its abilities is very, very tricky. It has potential extreme risks. It also has potential extreme benefits. The benefit of not having a nuclear war is that you don't have a nuclear war. The benefit of not having a dangerous superintelligent AI could be that we have a very aligned, positive superintelligent AI. And it has some short-term impacts as well. And to simplify my life story, at this point, I had concluded that my highest return on investment was to spend my life trying to align AI. That this was the way that I could have the best positive impact on the world. I mentioned some extreme uncertainties. Well, one of the simplest is, when would we have something that we could call AI? This is from the Dartmouth conference in 1956, where they were basically predicting AI over a summer. And I've done something that very few people have done, and I've read the conference proposal for the Dartmouth conference, and it's very, very good. It is written by the top people of the time, not only in theory, but the top people who had the most experience in actually getting computers to do what they wanted to. They had a variety of approaches. They sketched out potential problems, ways of overcoming those problems. It was really, really impressive, and so terribly wrong. 9 years later, Dreyfus, in a otherwise excellent publication that might have got more publicity if he hadn't compared AI makers with alchemists, but amongst the predictions he was making was one that was very wrong, which suggesting that essentially we'd reached the end of AI abilities. I think it's safe to say that neither of these predictions have exactly come true. These are, as far as we can extract, various predictions made about when we might have AI, and based on the date when the prediction was made. It is a bit complicated because there's no universally accepted term for what AI corresponds to or what it would be doing, but this is roughly what we can get. This is Turing's original prediction. And here is the AI winter, where everyone was pretending that they weren't working on AIs anymore. Now, this kind of uncertainty, these kind of predictions spread all over the place here, 10, 20, 30 years, is to be expected in this area, because this is not an area where anyone is going to be any good. James Shanto has looked at what makes human expertise good, and it's not so much about the expert, but about the domain in which they operate. There are some domains in which you have genuine expertise. Those are the ones that have features like the good performance on the left, and some where there are not, like the ones on the poor performance on the right. The expert agreement, whether the problem is decomposable or not, and above all else, whether you can get feedback, preferably immediate feedback, are the most important features here. And for example, anesthesiologists are true experts, whereas doctors who interpret mammograms are not really experts at what they do. I choose these examples because they're at comparable levels of education and skill, so it's not because of that, but it's because an anesthesiologist, their patient is either not unconscious or dead, which they will realize very, very quickly, whereas if you interpret a mammogram, your feedback as to whether it was successful or not will come several months later, if at all. And where AI predictions are concerned, we are kind of stuck in this area, and so we should expect poor performance, as we have seen. The only strong tendency that I was able to identify in the data is that people have a mild tendency to want to predict 15 to 30 years ahead of whenever the prediction was made. This seems a sort of safe guess, as sort of a few technology cycles ahead, but not too far in the future. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about AI? Are we talking about clanking robots with Austrian accents? No. A Terminator is an entity with the big muscles and no real brain. It demonstrated no particular skill at thinking. Terminator is basically an armored bear. It's natural that we would be afraid of it because that is our evolutionary past, but it's not something that will actually threaten human survival in any way. As this picture illustrates, in a sense, it is not the most muscly creature that is the most powerful, but the one that is the most coordinated and organized and capable of planning ahead of time. And now, if I said that there's great uncertainties in predicting AI, there's even greater uncertainties as to what form it might take. And there's a family of arguments that are not usually very helpful here, which are the formal arguments, where we replace the question of how powerful could AI become with another question that is very solvable. Like one of them would be on complexity categories for algorithms. If P is not NP, as most people expect, then we could say that any AI, no matter how smart, will not be able to solve traveling salesman problems exactly in reasonable time as the problem gets more complex. It just cannot break the NP-complete barrier. But the power of AI is not so much solving these formal problems exactly, but how well it can approximate a solution and to the problems that are relevant in our world, and more importantly, how much of a solution it can approximate that is better than what humans can come up with. Unfortunately, complexity classes do not give us an answer as to how smart an AI needs to be to outthink world leaders, for example. There are hints, though, that it could be extremely powerful. One argument in this favor is the idea of a one-minute corporation. Corporations are some of the most powerful entities in the world today, and they have capital and other physical resources, but most of their resources are in the people working there, in their cognitive capital. If we had an AI, we could create a corporation of this type, get the human capital of a corporation in a very easy way by just copy as much as we need it. And this corporation, unlike human-based corporations, would likely be much more unified and coordinated and would not need layers of middle management and the other mechanisms that corporations waste in order to make sure everyone is pointing in roughly the same direction. And this is what you can get just by copying from one human level intelligence. So this is sort of superintelligence via copying. Currently, there's a certain number of billion computers in the world. I don't update this number much because it all depends on what you count a computer being. And so these debates are endless. But let's say there's a few billion computers in the AI world. How many AIs does this correspond to? Well, probably quite a lot. If we have AIs doing the technology and the manufacturing of more computers, how many more AIs could we produce from that? Extremely high amounts. So essentially, we'd expect that once you get one human level algorithm, you would have billions upon billions of them. And this is D-Day, artistic rendering, and this is often seen as sort of physical courage on the part of the soldiers. But what D-Day was, above all else, was planning, assembling of logistics and of the equipment, managing of alliances. Huge amount of cognitive effort went into it to make it work long before any soldier disembarked on the beaches of Normandy. And this is the kind of tasks that algorithms could become very suited at. The Apollo project is an even more extreme example. There was some petrol and metal lying under the earth. Then politicians make certain decisions, business people, scientists, entrepreneurs all act on this, and because of this cognitive action together, suddenly there is a human artifact on the moon. General relativity, civil rights movements, mass mobilization. This is a cognitive skill. This is very few people could have done this. And other things like creating bestsellers. Again, this requires skills on the author's and the marketer's perspective. We don't normally think of these as intelligences, but they are very strong forms of intelligence. Of course, investment, a way in which intelligence leads directly to money today. So another way of thinking could be, suppose you took a super committee of the AI equivalents of Edison, Einstein, J.K. Rowling, Margaret Thatcher, Oprah, Confucius, Goebbels, Bernie Madoff, and Steve Jobs. You gave them all the data in the world and you ran them at thousands and thousands of times human speed. This entity, this super committee, which would have weeks, subjective weeks to think before answering every question, would probably find the internet and the human race as useful tools for achieving their goals. I won't belabor this point anymore. And these are based on analogies, and because there is not necessarily such a thing as human equivalent algorithms. The skills are developing at different rates, and the general intelligence might be coming quite slowly. But the point of this is that there is no reason to suspect that the power of AIs are limited in any way. Or there's no strong arguments that could say that we can be safe, that there are some things that AIs cannot achieve, or that mere intelligence would not be enough to achieve the Apollo project and pretty much anything. This suggests that AIs could become very powerful. Okay, that's one issue. But just because it becomes very powerful doesn't mean that it's necessarily dangerous. Another key aspect of that problem is that there's no natural containment for an AI. This is an agent in an environment, a toy diagram that anyone in the field is familiar with. An agent takes an action, the action goes into the environment changes to a new state and sends a reward to the agent. And the agent acts to maximize the reward. What is not pictured here is the human that gives the reward and designs it for a purpose, and can also reboot and redesign the agent in order to achieve whatever humans want to. Of course, the problem is the human is actually part of the environment. It isn't something separate. In fact, everything is part of the environment. There is no clean separation. And the more powerful the algorithms become, the more they have the ability to weigh on different aspects of this general environment. For instance, we could start with a spam filter, but a spam filter is a bit of a misnomer. It has no intrinsic desire to filter spam. It has a more specific goal: reduce proportion of unfiltered spam and filtered non-spam. That's more of a goal. how was this being measured? Maybe by human approval. This is doing a good job, this is doing a bad job. We label the filtered or non-filtered messages according to whether it's spam or not by our judgment. To get even more technical, as measured by input HA labeled human approval, so somewhere in some system there is a variable which is set according to our approval, and this is what is fed into the agent. Then go back to the diagram there. If the agent is very powerful, this variable is in the environment. This variable is therefore under the algorithm's indirect or direct control and is a target for its optimization. And the humans that want to keep the AI focused on filtering spam rather than manipulating variables are now just an obstacle for the AI. So this spam filter, without any negative anti-human sentiments, has now identified humans as an obstacle towards its reward maximization, which is the task that it has been given. It's because of this that Stuart Russell, one of the grandfathers of AI research, he literally wrote the book on it, said that no one in civil engineering talks about building bridges that don't fall down. They just call it building bridges. Right now, we have to say AI that is probably beneficial, but eventually that will be called AI. It's to emphasize that the safety aspect of AI is part of the intrinsic design. Now, if we do crack AI, on the other hand, there are huge positive outcomes available to us. Problems that we could solve, permanently solve. One of the first one we could solve is absolute poverty. Relative poverty is another challenge, and there's issues of distribution and freedom and things like that. But absolute poverty is, to slightly simplify, some people don't have enough stuff. They don't have enough shoes, they don't have enough housing, they don't have enough clean water, enough access to education, enough access to sanitation and healthcare, those sort of things. So these people do not have enough stuff. And building more stuff and having the infrastructure to distribute it is the kind of cognitive tasks that algorithms would be good at. There's also what we call blue-collar crime, or something that is obviously a crime when you look at it, if someone punches someone else. AIs are already showing how much power of surveillance they lead to, not necessarily in positive ways, but a side effect of this is that this kind of crime will probably be a thing of the past. And then there's the impact on war. Now, there are different ways that this can go, but if you consider war as a blue-collar crime at the scale of a nation, then there are at least some ways in which AIs would push strongly against this. It would become impossible to launch surprise attacks, for instance. In fact, I'd say a major feature of the conflict in Ukraine is that no one is surprised by any of the attacks that are going on. Everyone knows where the attacks are going to come way in advance. We have maps that update in real time. Now, there are other ways that AI may lead to more war, especially cyber war, but its effects, there's at least the possibility that some form of war may become impossible. Violence in general as a consequence of the diminishing of those two. Now, mental illness. Why could this help? Well, personalized, tested psychological interventions and therapy are some of the most effective things at helping with mental illness. And if everyone had a dedicated psychiatrist or therapist in their pocket and their phone to help them with that. And if these therapists could network together and find the best options, well, this is the kind of thing that might become much more solvable. And then disease. And I have put here the example of something that we don't tend to think of as a cure for disease, which is glasses. But it is. The disease is poor eyesight, and the cure is a physical implement. It tends to be that technological solutions for diseases are cheaper and easier to build en mass than biological ones, such as medicines. And then there's a possibility that it might end up overcoming death. And I really always like putting this example here, because the idea of death in our culture has been subsumed with so many philosophical, spiritual, moral components that it's not seen so much as just the extreme version of disease. Basically, if we had an AI that solved every disease, it's hard to see what people would die of, especially because the best way of solving these diseases is to prevent senility, prevent decrepitude, keep people healthy indefinitely. So there's at least the possibility that this kind of knowledge and manufacturing ability could solve death. Anyway, something maybe worth thinking about. And lastly, I want to mention anomie, the sort of feeling of pointlessness that a lot of people have in modern society, feeling of lost purpose. This is the kind of thing that really smart machines could solve. This is not a inevitable feature of the human condition. There are purposes that people can have and can make that will help them overcome this. Anyway, these are looking at some of the upsides. Let's get back to the problems, and let's get back at how we might solve the problems. In a way, we could summarize the AI danger thesis as saying that AI is effective at unbounded, unfriendly goals. So the unfriendly is basically it's not in our interest, and unbounded is that this is not contained. And there are proposals to attack the problem on each of these words pretty much. We can try and reduce its effectiveness. We can try and contain its impact. We can try and make it aligned with humanity. And some approaches try and remove the idea of goals in the first place. I've contributed to some approaches in each one of these. But for the moment, I'm going to be focusing on, well, a method that can help with most of these methods. And that's the idea of concept extrapolation. Model splintering is when key features or concepts in your world model break, like when you move from Newtonian physics to general relativity, or before that, when you moved from Aristotelian physics to Newtonian physics. And suddenly, concepts that you thought were clearly defined or made sense no longer really do. Like gravity as a force, moving from Newtonian to a general relativity, it's no longer a force. It's not that it is a more subtle or different force that has a different rate of decay or something like that. It's just no longer conceived of as a force. And the concept is completely different. I'm less familiar with Aristotelian physics, but there's ideas like objects tending to their proper place that made some sort of predictions. It wasn't useless. It made some sort of sense. It sort of explained why stones fall, at least if you didn't squint too hard at it. But now the idea of a proper place for objects just doesn't make any sense in Newtonian framework. And concept extrapolation is how can we extend these concepts across a model break? To pick an example, we have the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and across many changes in the concept of what equality and what men mean, this led some 100 or so years later to votes for women. It is a descendant of the same principle, even though it seems completely alien from the original formulation of it, which was, as people point out, rich white slave owners. But the concept there as who counts as a proper moral agent extended. This is an example of a concept extrapolation, which would not make sense in the original formulation, but yet descends across model breaks. Another example that I use is if you consider a Croatian communist Yugoslav nationalist in the 1980s, well, they're not going to have a very cheerful decade as the different aspects of their personalities start breaking apart. But I want to point out that in the 1980s, this could be one thing. You didn't have to think that these were different aspects of your personality. This was one thing. And now suddenly you have to consider them as separate because humans are actually reasonably good at navigating these transitions. They're definitely better than algorithms tend to be. They don't sort of go paper clipping, for example. A few more examples from the past, the idea of honor being vital. Now, if you look at honor today in the Wikipedia article, it's a mishmash of keeping your promises, reacting with violence, chastity for women, various things about personal relationships. It doesn't really make much sense, and different honor cultures differ on what honor is, but they all feel that it is something. It is something specific. If the Greeks had an AI, this would probably be an important part of the goal they would have given it. In Victorian middle class England, you might have ideals that women should be protected. So the honor is vital as a concept that's completely splintered. Women should be protected is a concept that is splintering or is at the end of the process of that. I want to point out that this is not a modern change. Nowadays, we question the gender binary in ways we didn't before. But in Victorian middle class England, the gender binary would determine your clothes, whether you could vote, whether you could work at certain professions. And it determined so much about your identity. And this has been weakening for over a century, long before we questioned the general binary. In 1960, whether someone was a woman or not gave you far less information than it gave in 1860. And nowadays, we have the importance that happiness is important. And this is something we'd like to put in AIs. But I suspect that happiness in the potential future will break the same way that honor broke and that the woman should be protected concepts are in process of breaking. So there is a challenge of extending what we want across the possible crazy futures that we get. This is just another illustration of model splintering as physics moves from Aristotelian to quantum mechanics. And let's zoom in a little bit on one a bit more. We start with, it feels hot or it feels cold. Well, we start by formalizing that only a few centuries ago as something like the height of a tube of mercury. And now we're starting to get quantifications. And then we get an even better definition, derivative with respect to entropy. And finally, we get entropy itself is quantum information, and therefore get a complex theory of what temperature is. So this is a natural progression, but I want to point out that it could have gone in a different direction. We could have focused on the feeling aspect of it. Cashing out it feels hot and cold as temperature, and which went down this path, is one choice, but it could also cash out as subjective feeling and how we interpret those. So these are just some lists of moral-based different moralities that we can expect will become broken in some ways in extreme new circumstances. What's rather interesting is that all of these, they're incompatible with each other. None of them make sense with the others pretty much. However, their conclusions are very similar. Basically, all of them agree that you shouldn't murder people. Murder basically being killing of morally valuable people without cause, which is astounding. If you took 7 different moral systems at random, and you would not expect them to reach the same conclusion. Yes, they do in so many different areas. So this suggests part of a way forward, in that it's not so much the premises themselves which are important, but the applications of it, the consequences of what behaviors they encourage or don't in the world. This was another example just illustrating how could you extrapolate a small village, could you extrapolate the concerns of Warwick in the 15th century to the whole future of the universe and the potential AIs that exist there. It is going to be, extrapolating our own values is going to be something akin to this. And this has applications to most of AI safety. In a sense, I would say that almost every problem in AI safety comes down to a failure of extrapolating a concept or a value properly. Like the hidden complexity of wishes, where your mother can end up horribly burned when you tell the AI, save my mother from the burning building, and the building immediately explodes and throws her body out of it. This was because the concept of save and maybe the concept of who the mother is have not been properly extended by the AI. Good heart problems are exactly that. We have a measure that is used and that is equivalent with the desired behavior in typical circumstances, and then you push it to more extreme circumstances and those break apart. So it's because of reasons like this that I've said that concept extrapolation is necessary and almost sufficient for AI alignment. It's almost sufficient because it helps in all these ways, and it's necessary because our own values, our own future values are not defined. Therefore, if we have an AI aligned with our values, it needs to be able to extrapolate them at least as well as we can if it wants to help us. The first challenge in this is to generate the right extrapolation. In fact, that's in a sense the most important challenge. There's a common failure mode in alignment research where you talk about an AI that is trained on, say, videos of happy humans. And we want it to learn that we want happy humans, but in fact it learns that we want videos of happy humans. And then if it's super intelligence, it takes over the universe and tiles it with videos of happy humans, etc. It's a common trope. But if we could get it to generate both hypotheses, that would be a great progress. If we could generate, yes, maybe we want videos of happy humans, or maybe we actually want the happy humans. Both of these are reasonable guesses at what we want and how to extrapolate its training data. And at that point, it could ask us which one we want, or become conservative across both of them. That would also lead to acceptable outcomes. But the key is to generate the right extrapolation. In terms of practical work, here you can see a healthy pair of lungs and a pair of lungs with a lung collapse in it. And there were algorithms that were trained to distinguish these two. There was just one small problem. Collapsed lungs are treated by an implant. The implant is visible in X-rays. And so when you thought that you were training a lung healthiness detector, it turned out that in many cases you were training an implant detector. So are you a collapsed lung detector or a chest drain detector? What we're going to be doing is finding ways of disambiguating both, of generating both suggestions from the training data. So it can see the difference between implant or not implant, and the difference between collapsed lung or not collapsed lung, and will disambiguate the two and ask for human advice there. It's especially tricky in this area because though we have entries in all the three categories, it's quite rare that we'd have X-rays of collapsed lungs without implants, and it's essentially impossible that we would have X-rays of healthy lungs with implants. So we don't have the cross terms in the data. But that is the sort of thing that aligned AI will be solving. Another, just a small illustrative example, this is more of a toy model. This is the game Coin Run, where the aim of the little robot is to go to the right and get the coin. When you generate a level where the coin is somewhere else, the robot just goes all the way to the right and ignores the coin. So essentially it had two plausible rewards given its data. The first was that its objective was go to the right. The second was that its objective was get to the coin, but it only generated one of them. So the one of going to the right. So just getting the algorithm to consider the possibilities of extrapolating to new environments is a large chunk of the battle. Choosing the right one is great, but just getting it to generate good candidates is part of the challenge. So in the three-part structure of a talk, you end it by telling them what you've already told them. So AIs could become very powerful. This could be disastrous if they are not aligned. Concept extrapolation is necessary and almost sufficient for AI alignment. And finally, we are making theoretical and practical progress on this subject. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Lots to think about there. So I will ask a couple of questions first, and I will also look at what audience members type into the Q&A window. So in terms of the companies that you expect to work with in aligned AI, are you working with companies who are deciding how to use AI today as part of their overall strategy, figuring out which bits of AI to use and what might work with it and what might not? Or are you instead working with companies who are developing AI? Or are you actually just looking at companies that might be developing advanced AGI rather than today's AI? So who are you working with?
More the companies that are developing AI. But one form of concept extrapolation is coping with out-of-distribution effects. Yes, for the companies that are developing AIs, but it would be also with companies that are deploying AI, because it's often during the use of the AI, as the distribution changes, as the world that it's interacting with changes, that detecting this change and coming up with candidates for how to extrapolate its goal becomes important. In a sense, most AI failures today, or limits to its use, are out of distribution problems, and concept extrapolation can solve those. So if that is available at the development and at the deployment phase, but the aim is to do it more with the developers.
So out of distribution failure means that an AI has been trained on a particular set of examples, but then the ones it encounters in the real life don't always conform to the same patterns, and they may in some subtle ways be significantly different. And you're suggesting that with the proper degree of concept extrapolation, AI will be less prone to make mistakes in these circumstances.
Yes. The problem is that unless we can actually predict all of the situations it'll be deployed in and visualize them as an AI would, the training data is not sufficient to determine the reward function. The coin run example is, it's obvious in retrospect that going all the way to the right or going for the coin are both potential candidates. But it's plausible that a human would never think of the going to the right as an option, or at least not easily, just because the coin is so visibly there. Yes, this is what it must be. Platform games, you get coins in. So so we can't rely on the training data to pin down what we actually mean, what we actually want. But what tends to happen, this is a bit of a simplification, but what tends to happen today is that you train on the training data and you get one output, one classifier, one reward function, one policy, and then you deploy that until it goes into situations where it's out of distribution and then it breaks. What we're aiming for is that when it gets out of distribution, the multiple different candidates for it are then generated, and the algorithm can either ask which one is correct or become conservative across the options. Like one example could be if you have a retail store with CCTV cameras, and they train a shoplifter detector based on the data that they have. Now, there's a possibility that this may end up as a racial profiler detector, or maybe a certain clothing style detector. And quite apart from the bias and fairness issues of either of those, there's also the fact that it is not a shoplifter detector, so it has failed. So with our approach would be that when the algorithm is confronted by behavior that doesn't fit with its training data, so it is, oh, this is a member of a certain racial group, or they're wearing a certain amount of clothing, but they're not stealing anything, this is out of distribution, or vice versa, someone is stealing something, but they don't correspond to my training data, that then the algorithm would ask, in an active learning sense, basically, am I a shoplifter detector? Am I a clothing profiler? Or that sort of questions.
And can the AI generate this kind of concepts by itself?
Yes, not in the way that we, not in the way that we're thinking. It won't generate a deep concept of clothes necessarily, but it can disentangle concepts of clothing worn and actions. I mean, even today you have examples of you can reshape celebrities, I believe, in certain. You can reshape their expressions and their clothing in images, I believe, with certain algorithms.
Sounds credible. Yep.
Yeah, deep fakes is an example. Yeah, deep fakes is a good enough example. But the point is that it has disambiguated from this is the face of the person from they are talking about this, so that you can separate the two and then put them back together in a different way. But that was done by hand with human oversight, but it can certainly be automated, and that's what we're doing.
The question with the most votes for the time being is by Martin Bielecki, who asks about the objectives that we should be imagining that the AIs would have. Now, you referred to various ideas of morality in the past, things involving shame and guilt and honor, or sometimes some religious notions, and you were suggesting, well, we probably wouldn't be programming these things into our AIs. But are there better examples of the concepts that you think would appropriately be programmed into AIs? For example, Martin suggests biological immortality, super long, healthy lifespans. And I noticed on YouTube, Candidate has suggested, well, maybe it should be maximizing human freedoms. So do you have a list of such likely objectives, or is that orthogonal to the task that you set yourself?
It's not fully orthogonal. It is a bit, after the revolution, will everyone have one pony or two ponies style of question, in that the getting an AI in the vague area of human positive flourishing of any type is the greater part of the challenge. Ensuring that if we do get super intelligent AIs, or that if the AIs determine our future, that this is survivable and positive for humanity according to pretty much any ethical system, is the big part of the challenge. I did do a research agenda version 0.9 where I saw ways of synthesizing together people's internal different preferences and how you might combine. You can also similarly combine preferences from different people, which is somewhat easier to get a sort of synthetic view of the future of humanity. You may want to go for idealized preferences more, like if the people had thought about, yes, you want a hamburger right now because you're starving, but maybe if you were relaxed and fed and rich, what would your longer term preferences be? There's a lot of different approaches, and I haven't looked into them too much because I just feel the challenge of getting close to the point where you can start choosing amongst them is the greater part of the challenge.
Question by Lucy Wills, which is now the topmost, is about how do we avoid our human biases from giving AIs the wrong guidance? Lucy asks, we need to avoid replicating current bias and unhelpful assumptions in novel AI systems. Can we really rely on humans to identify and address this? Or do you think that AI in some different way will reach viewpoints that extrapolate beyond our limited biases?
Well, for biases, the first thing is to detect them. So if you have data sets with certain correlations, then let's say between gender and professions, then if you can notice this, and by you, I was thinking the algorithm can notice that there is a correlation there. But if it can generate each of the features as a separate one, like gender, and gender is one, it has a classifier for gender, it has a classifier for profession. It realizes that they're correlated, but it can generate them independently. Then you can fix bias pretty much there by just saying focus on the ignore the gender one, focus on the one that is disambiguated from it. It's not a perfect solution, but it would be, I feel, a lot better than a lot of what's being done today. Because it might even generate suggestions of biases that we're not aware of currently. That there is this bias in this data set that brown-eyed people are more likely to have outdoor jobs. I have no idea. But that's the point, some bias that we don't know that might be detectable. And now as to how we run the AIs, there's a lot of things I might like to do when they make me supreme ruler of the world and I tell people how to run their AIs, but in practice, we won't have much control over that. So we'll try and just improve the ability to detect these biases and then to mitigate against them.
There's a question from PNJ who wants to understand a bit more about how this concept extrapolation would work. Mm-hmm. I should say that PNJ, like myself, has a past life as a software architect. So his question is, what are the design patterns associated with concept extrapolation? And it sounds nice as a concept, but can you provide a little bit more insight into what's involved?
What do you mean by design patterns?
A pattern is something you'd recognize something happening in different places, and you say, "Oh, right, this is a good design pattern, or this is a bad design pattern." So that you're not trying to design everything from scratch every time. Initially, design patterns were in physical architecture, and the architects had various rules which they followed to stop them just trying to have to remember how to do buildings all the time.
I fear I may not understand this concept that well, but I'll try and answer. Ultimately, we'll try and provide tools that can be fit into a workflow in an automated way, such as if we had that shoplifter detector, then it would be inside the software, and at a moment where it became ambiguous what the software's task was, this would then throw an alert. The process would get automatically, and it would generate the 2 possible or 3 or 4 possible interpretations of what its task was. And then it could either become conservative between all of them, or ask at that point, flag a programmer, and it wouldn't ask, am I this? It would be this situation, shoplifting, yes or no. And it would choose samples that would disambiguate between the different extrapolations. So that's a potential workflow for how this could work. I'm not sure if that's a design pattern.
I think that's a good first answer. We'll look forward to seeing more details of your system online when it's appropriate. I don't know to what extent some of your methods may be patent pending, or is that how you're working?
Yes, we are currently getting a patent, and I've had to adjust from my academic urge to tell everyone everything immediately.
So Eugene Diana wonders that does it make sense that when we're trying to align these AIs, that we're trying to outsmart them, but they're already smarter than us? Does this even make sense, he asks?
We're not trying to outsmart them. Some approaches rely on outsmarting them. These are going to fail. Yeah, over the long term, you do not outsmart something that is smarter than you. The aim is to get their goals, their motives aligned with yours. If you have someone that's superhuman in some way, but their goals are aligned with yours, then this is a positive development. I mean, we try and do it with, say, humans, with, say, fiduciary duty, for example, and lawyers. So lawyers are meant to, and in most cases do, act in our interests, even though they know so much more about the law than we ever could. And we've set up a system that allows that to work reasonably okay. And similarly, we'd want that these algorithms, much smarter than us, are acting in our interests. And if we get that, then it doesn't matter how much smarter they get, because they're just becoming smarter at acting in our interests.
Another question by Lucy Wills, who says, we are speaking a lot today about what humans want to need, but if we're being truly ethical, shouldn't we be talking about what all living species, maybe they are broader stakeholders and rather than just human well-being?
I agree. Personally, I strongly agree with that, and I would like animals and most forms of consciousness to be included. But as I say, this is in the category of not the main challenge. Getting it anywhere close to even human alignment is enough of a challenge. But I agree, ultimately, this is how I would prefer that it would go. Ultimately, and once the AIs are shown to be safe and survivable, the AIs themselves have a claim as moral patients. So their rights would be of interest. But I want to get them safe for humanity and the rest of the species before we consider their own rights.
Let me take a question from Robert Whitfield. If humans have to decide on questions or options posed by the AI, so the AI notices various possible interpretations and it asks humans, should I be doing this or should I be doing something else? Is it a danger that we humans will be overwhelmed by a large volume of questions? And in any case, might we answer some of these questions wrongly and therefore have wrong implications? Is that part of your model?
Yes. So I've been talking about generating the possible extrapolations. And I've been a bit vague about what to do after. I've just basically said, ask a human or become conservative. There's a whole host of things. The first one is ignore it. like if the difference is small enough. If people move to electric cars, for instance, if you have a car detector, the features that they see will be subtly different, especially on acceleration and maybe on shape. But it is logical for them to conclude this is still a car. And similarly, there'll be thousands of situations where the correct answer will be obvious and does not need to inquire about it. The choosing when to inquire will be an important part of the algorithm. And I noticed that someone had mentioned that there was a particular AI startup that is already removing racial profiling from shoplifting algorithms, which sounds like good news. But the point of this approach is that it can remove biases that we don't know about. We don't have to be aware that this can be an issue in order to tackle it. Humans tend to be quite good at dealing with a problem once we've phrased the problem and we know it's a problem. It's trickier to deal with problems that we're not even aware of yet.
Maybe we time for a few more questions because they're coming thick and fast. They're feeding on each other now. To what extent is your views similar to that of Stuart Russell's? This is by Eugene Diana, because he has said we shouldn't give AIs goals. We should give AI the imperative to check with humans what humans want. Is that the same as you're proposing, or is there lots of difference?
I mean, I think that's more of a semantic difference because checking with humans is itself a goal. So whether that counts as a goal or not is more sort of just, semantic and terminology. In practice, I get the impression that I'm quite close to Stuart Russell, but he is more optimistic about getting alignment from improvements to current technology. Whereas I think that we need to do, well, in a sense, I think we need to solve value extrapolation by working directly on value extrapolation. He would have, my impression is, more the view of as we improve current technology with an eye on good outcomes, this will of itself solve these kind of problems, or contribute to solving these kind of problems.
How important are laws and regulations going to be in assisting with alignment? I refer also to a question by Gordon Silverman, who points out that the EU is considering new laws governing AI. Are you in favor of that kind of initiative, or do you think that the solutions will come in an extra legal form?
Well, I actually have a paper on that. Or at least I'm the last author, so there are other people who have written sensible things on it. I think we have to distinguish between short-term goals and long-term goals. In terms of solving short-term problems, the EU's thing seems fine. In terms of solving alignment problem for potentially extremely powerful algorithms, I feel it's pretty irrelevant currently. In a sense, we're not ready for regulations on those issues because we can't even define the problem. But I'm optimistic that as alignment tools improve, not only can we solve the problems more, but we can also define them more. As like if this approach, like if we have something that detects bias, for example, then we can regulate and say, you are not allowed to have bias in your algorithms. Bias is measured by this. So the more tools you have, the more sensible regulations might be implementable. But I feel that at the moment, there is not much that you can do to regulate potential superintelligences in any sensible way.
What about another legal mechanism, which is that of patents? We mentioned that you are patenting some of your ideas. Didier Cornell asks, don't you think that patents and other IP rules making things secret and for private interests are one of the most dangerous, unethical, harmful ways to work on benevolent AI?
I am not sure. There are very strong difference of opinions in the alignment community on this. Some of them think that OpenAI and DeepMind should just shut up and stop publishing anything, and that this would improve safety immeasurably. Others think that's, well, the opposite, and that openness is the way to go. It's, I mean, in most areas, I'm in favor of openness. It generally is a positive thing, but I don't know, because you are increasing, like, was it a good idea to develop and release GPT-3? Possibly. It's not, because a lot of people are using GPT-3 or similar methods like that for honing their alignment methods, which they couldn't do if this was not, if it has not been developed. On the other hand, there'd be less of a rush to do so if it had not been developed and made available. So yes, I just don't know. We are a commercial company, so that's why we're going for the IP. Though it seems that patents in computer science don't last that long in practice.
Well, thanks for being open in your answer to that question about how open should we be with some of our insights and ideas. I agree. I mean, these things are hard, and we are at some risk in publishing some of this information of allowing a very destructive AI to be created. Not yet, perhaps, but at some stage in the not too distant future, we'll just keep on doing what we're doing, and then, and it's already possible that people can use some of the fake AI mechanisms to produce very convincing, but very inflammatory, very divisive fakes.
I've actually found that, say, deep fakes or things like that have had far less impact than I expected. It seems that the main impact of that is that people don't believe things without provenance data anymore.
But do we know when we're being influenced by deep fakes? Often the best advertising is when we don't even realize we're being advertised to, and it goes in the back of our mind, and we say, of course I've always been a supporter of Brexit, or of course I've always been a fan of gun control or whatever, without realizing where that has come from.
I mean, there's a difference between advertising and influential advertising, which is a potential issue, and deep fakes, which I think is a much narrower issue. The reason why deep fakes I don't think are that effective is because the person can deny it. And if you do a deep fake of which Obama says, let's bomb Australia, then it's clear. And you have a very narrow window in which people might believe that this is actually genuine. And newspapers, or media in general, are reasonably good at sourcing their stories. You've had Photoshop for a long time, so the ability to create fake pictures has been with us for a long time, and people haven't used that.
Kim Solis congratulates you for being immune to a bias which he detects in many AI researchers, which he thinks is unhelpful. He says it's very encouraging that you do not regard it as necessary that humans must always be in charge of stewardship over the earth. How did you come to be immune to this bias yourself?
I don't know that I am immune to this bias. I would not like to have the Earth boiled away in 1 billion years when the sun expands, and to have basically life scorched off the Earth because of the heat and the oceans evaporating. So in a sense, I would want to avoid that. And so that's a certain judgment about, I have a judgment about how the Earth should go. I'm definitely not in favor of the sort of extreme exploitation of the planet that we have now, and the suffering of, as well, especially factory farming and a lot of other things of that case. I mean, I think maybe the way in which I don't care about the bias is that I would like the Earth to be preserved and protected, and I don't particularly care whether it's humans or algorithms that do that. But I do have a certain preference for how it goes and doesn't go. Like, I prefer to not have extreme global warming, for example, which is a condition that I want the Earth to be in. So in a sense, this is a human judgment about where the Earth should go. So is that human's stewardship over the Earth or not? Anyway.
It's an indirect stewardship, because the goal is to set up AIs with values sufficiently aligned to avoiding runaway global warming and so on. So we will no longer be able to intervene and overpower the AIs, but they will be acting in alignment with these issues.
Yes. So, and I do not know what other AI researchers feel about this issue. I mean, just randomly politically, I would guess that they are more likely to be in favor of environmental protection than an average person, just based on political leanings. But who knows?
I think the question is here, is there more emphasis on the alignment problem, or is there more emphasis on the control problem? And some people think, well, we can control AIs. AIs can be smarter than us, but we are still controlling them because we're going to keep them in a box. And all the things that you listed in one of your earlier slides and said, well, none of these work.
So I've spent part of my life trying to design solutions like that. And in a sense I've succeeded, and in a sense I've failed. I have designs for Oracle AIs that I think could work, and low impact AIs. And the problem with all these designs is that the amount of useful work we can get out of the AI is very small. So we can keep them constrained if we accept that we get very little out of them.
And other people will say, come on, we can get more value from our investment if we allow it out of the box a little bit. And
yes, I've yet to see a control method that scales to longer terms, more powerful machines, general interactions, and that isn't vulnerable to someone making a small mistake at some point. Though I should mention that Eric Drexler has a design, I believe, called Superintelligence as Service, where he says how you can get superintelligence performance from without having the risks of true superintelligences or autonomous superintelligences. That could go into the control category. But I believe even him sees this as an interim solution rather than a permanent solution. So it might work for a few years, but we need something different after that.
Sounds like I should invite Eric back on Land of Futurists one of these days. Let's try and do the two most questions that have the questions with the most votes, and then we'll wind up. One of them is by Luca Artisani. Do you see any benefits in framing AI alignment as a mere safety issue? Yes, this may enable wider adoption, but there are other ethical issues that will be moving into the background if all we talk about is safety.
This is more sort of marketing or question there. Personally, I think that emphasizing the safety issue is good because, as in bridge building, there are a certain collection of common goals that you want with every bridge, which is that it doesn't fall down. I think that bracketing those issues and focusing on the safety gets more buy-in from more people. In that you can generally tell people we want bridges to not fall down, and people generally agree all over the world, even if there are some specific cases where some people want some bridges to fall down. But that's my personal judgment, and whether this is a good idea or not is, as I say, more a marketing question or survey question that I'm not confident I know the answer to.
The last question is by Zhaohu Zhu, who asks you about DeepMind's recent work, Gato. And I was wondering about it as well, because it seems to be one of a number of things that have come out in the last month or so, which are making people think maybe AGI is closer than we'd expected. And I have seen revisions online in various estimation communities, when people do this, super forecasting communities, and they seem to have revised forward the date in which it is now generally expected there will be superintelligence. So what is your assessment of this Gato? Is it just a quirk, or is it something profound?
I hate the fact that my plan was to look at Gato next week in detail. I probably told myself there's no need to get it right now. I can focus on other work. By the time anyone wants my opinion on it next week, it's fine. So sorry, I don't know.
That's a fair answer.
Very impressive, but I have only the most superficial view of it. I probably should have dived into it more earlier on, but there's so many things that I should be diving into.
As I understand, it's a fairly closely defined piece of AI which can solve the same parameters a large number of different problems. And it doesn't have the world's best solution to any of them, but the fact that the same model can be used in so many different cases, maybe 60 different cases, is a sign that it's reaching a higher state of generality.
That's the impression I got. I don't know anything more than that. It seems impressive.
Okay. But what about the Palm from Google, and what about the DALL-E 2? Are these signs that AI might be accelerating faster than people thought in the past? You mentioned that forecasts generally put AGI 15 to 30 years into the future, independent of when they were made. Is that going to change now, and that more people are going to pick the 15-year time horizon rather than the 30-year time horizon?
My very subjective impression, and this is entirely subjective, was that AI was stagnating for a long time. After deep learning came on, it started accelerating a lot. And then there were a few years where things seemed less dramatic. I think 2 years ago, maybe, I was feeling things seem to have slowed down. There's a lot of research and a lot of results, but it seems less dramatic than it was. But now I feel that they've gone back to accelerating again. But that is a very subjective impression, but that's my feeling for how things are going.
Well, thanks very much, Stuart. You've answered a whole range of questions openly, candidly, thoughtfully. There's a lot going on in the chat. I'll make a copy of it and send it to you if you want to reflect on it later, along with the Q&A. But let me say thanks once again, and say goodbye to the formal part, and thank you very much.
Thank you.